warm welcome to everyone. My name is Jonsson, and I'm super happy to be sharing today's discussion. We're 3 weeks into the war in Ukraine, and for that occasion, we brought together a very interesting panel to give a discussion of several aspects. A warm welcome to everyone following us online as well. Most of you are there. Please feel free to post all of your questions, and we will deal with them in the Q&A. Structure for today is very simple. We'll have each of our experts give around 5 to 7 minutes of their respective takes, and then we'll have a discussion with you in the audience here as well. So without further ado, with us we have, first of all, Johan Norberg, whose title I have no idea about, but he has been working on Russian military affairs for 10, 15, 20 years, and he's an officer, and he's been running Swedish Defence Research Agency's Russian military studies program, which has been continuously producing some of the best open source analysis on 10 years prognosis on Russian military capability. He's also a PhD student with Beatrice Oyser, St. Andrews, Glasgow, close enough. But Johan is great, so that's good. We also have Ilmari Käihkö, who's associate professor and senior lecturer here. He is something as interesting, both a colleague on our research program that we're running right now for the Swedish Civil Continuous Agencies on non-military warfare. Ilmari is an ethnographer who's, among other things, done ethnographic studies with Ukrainian volunteers. And he will talk a little bit about determination and the will to defend in Ukraine right now. And last but absolutely not least, we have Danielsson, who's also an associate professor here at the Swedish Defence University and a senior lecturer. Her research is focused in particular on the importance of cities, urban warfare, and what that means, which is something we've seen with quite interesting results of today. The Russian forces are mostly moving around cities, they're trying to siege in Kiev, etc., etc. But enough from me. Let's pass the floor over to Johan, who will set us off, and warm welcome to everyone who came. So, Johan.
Thank you so much. My name is Johan Norberg. Pleased to meet you all here in this room and elsewhere. 7 minutes, you said? Right, this will be quick. I assess Russia's future fighting power, the fighting power of Russia's armed forces for a living. Mostly that is very theoretical, abstract. You have plans, you have numbers, you have figures, you have maps. Suddenly, I have a lot of empirical material. I would rather have done without it, but now I have. So what I will talk to you about is how we used to assess military capability. And what was reasonably right and wrong in what we did. And what of our tentative lessons learned. So this is how we used to do it. This is the report. We publish it once every 3 years. You see military capability in 2019, there you have the different chapters lined up very neatly. The two first ones, they are about current capabilities. What does Russia have today, and what can they do with their forces? Because that's the basis for what they will have in 10 years' time. They cannot change all of their forces in 10 years, even if they wanted to, because they're simply too big. Then we have 3 chapters on security policy, economy and military expenditure, and defense industry. They are important factors in shaping future military capabilities. The policy, what threats do you see? What do you want to do about them? Economy, how much money do you want to spend? How much money do you have? And defense industry, can you build all the kit, for example? And then we sort of try to push the present, 2019, through these factors and look into a 10-year perspective. This is how we used to do it. So first there will be some slides about the military aspects, which is my turf, and then some things that I have learned for the moment. One thing that is important that you can study is geography. Geography matters in wars. I won't go through all the details here, but Russia is big, railways matter, etc., where you have your bases matter and so on. This can all be read about, and I can explain more later if we want so in the Q&A. Geography matters. What forces do they fight with? Well, this is force groupings. I won't go through the details. It's all in our report, but they cobble together tailored groups of forces to go into a war, to solve a certain assignment. It's ground forces centric, air and navy in support. They fight in an area roughly 300 times 300 kilometers in the abstract sense. Then terrain and all that always matters. And this is just an example. The important thing is you might not even see it down in the corner to the right hand, about 65,000, 130,000, 100,000-ish. Depends on the assignment at hand. We believed in 2019 that Russia could cobble together 5 of those, 1 per military district. 5 times 130,000, something like that. And this is based on order of battle, the organizational charts we find, open source figures on personnel, et cetera, et cetera. And they can reach to a certain sort of a bit away from Russia with ground forces and with air forces. You can assess that depending on where the railways are, et cetera, and where the bases are. So this is what we thought. So what did we reasonably get right and what did we get wrong? If you take the classical military approach in what you can do, time, troop, terrain. Tiden, truppen, terrängen. As my Sergeant Major used to tell me when I was an army recruit long ago. Well, we believed in 2019 that to start this war with a group of forces, Russia would need a month, because that was what we had seen in exercises. What happened last year? Well, they started basically in April, piling up forces for this operation in Ukraine. So that one was not really good. We have to rethink that approach. Troops, we said 5 groups of forces, joint forces, air, navy, and ground. I think we have seen 3 or 4 involved in Ukraine if you look at command and control guesses that are out there. They are not joint forces. There seem to be definite problems between air and ground forces, for example. So you can not really talk about joint operations. So that one wasn't too bad, although I'm not very pleased with the result in detail. And if you look at the different forces, when we look at exercises, etc., before, ground forces do combined arms. Infantry, artillery, engineers, and all sort of working together as a machinery. Well, to a point here. There have been obvious problems. Air Force, they do air defense to protect the operation, and they do ground attack to support the ground operation. Really, have they? Or how well has that worked? I'm not too sure about that one either. Navy, they serve as a kind of a long-range defense for this operation in Ukraine, in that they have forces in the Arctic, in the Baltic Sea, Mediterranean, Black Sea, sort of as a sort of shield far away. And they can open new operational directions, a landing, for example, talk about landing in Odessa, etc. I'm not sure we have seen that, but they haven't done much of that yet. Naval forces have been surprisingly quiet. So we have definitely room for improvement in how we approach that. Terrain, you saw the map. Yes, terrain matters. And yes, Ukraine was too big. That's what the reason I believed, I actually disagreed with Oscar. I didn't really think this war would come because it's simply too big. Ukraine is too big to conquer with the forces Russia has. So I was wrong on that one. And Medabal actually looked at the map and tried to figure out how they would do it. So terrain matters, and that was at least somewhat right. In our assessment, we used to say railways matter for this big ground forces-centric operations. How do you move all the stuff into the war theater where you want to fight? So former Soviet Union has the same railway network. So we said, yes, that plus another 300 kilometers based on logistics and so on. So the 300 kilometers bit was roughly right. That's basically how far they have got into Ukraine-ish. But we were wrong about the railway network. They haven't been able to use that in Ukraine. But they can go to the border of the Russian Federation and then they have to load onto trucks, as far as I have seen. Anyway, so that one was quite good. All the problems we have heard about in the Russian forces, morale, command control, logistics, what have you not. We didn't actually address them in our report. We said delimitations, we can't do it. We don't have the time. And these are very real problems that affect the operation, but it hasn't stopped the Russian operation. Yet, anyway. Before we sort of delve too much into all the problems the Russians have, they're not done yet, it's my thing. So we have to rethink that aspect next time. Some tentative lessons learned, my time is running out. It's too early to tell, and it's too little clarity on what we can actually see. And also, we should be modest about what can we actually say about something as complex as a war-fighting operation on this scale. This is the biggest one in Europe since 1945, as far as I understand. And all the independently moving parts that are still interdependent. How do you actually get that all to work? And how do you sort of model the violent interaction that is war between two adversaries? You can war game to a point, but it's always abstractions. And now this is very real. We can be very ambitious in what we say, but we have to do it with precisions. We have to be clear with our delimitations, our assumptions, and our sources. And they are drying up in Russia at the moment, the open source material that I used to work with anyway. And we have to be explicit with the gaps we have in our analysis. It's not enough just to say we have these limitations, but that also means you have the following gaps in what you actually can say. I'll stop there because I've overstayed my welcome and come back to the other points later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johan. That's plenty of discussion. Pass it over straight away to Ilmari.
I want to start by saying that it's too early to tell. It's not too early to tell in every aspect, because what this war already shows is that we have greatly overestimated the Russian military capabilities, and we have greatly underestimated the Ukrainian military capabilities and the Ukrainian will to defend the country. And for Russia, of course, this is a great political miscalculation. The assumption that there would be a repeat of the 2014 Crimean scenario obviously isn't working. It didn't work, and this was clear already during the first days of the war. It will be interesting to learn why this happened. Why did they assume this kind of very optimistic scenario? And there are theories out there from FSB polls done before the war, which then showed that Ukrainians are pretty fed up with their government. There are these Putin's strange understandings of unity between the Russian and Ukrainian people, saying basically that the Ukrainians are Russians too, and Russians, of course, would not resist Putin. There is an idea that or theory that there are very few key decision makers. There's maybe from 2 to 12 people who can affect Putin's decisions, and if and when these people are yes sayers, then they wouldn't contradict Putin's ideas. The key consequence, of course, is that during the early days of war, we saw very limited use of force from the Russian forces. And they, for instance, they bypassed cities, they targeted military installations and troops, but they didn't target political or civilian targets, which is very important. And also, we didn't see this kind of shock and awe that we, for instance, saw in the Iraq war in 2003, where the Russian Air Force, especially, would have come and destroyed Ukrainian anti-air capability, established control over air. This is something that has been very confusing for many of us who expected this to be the very first thing. It's also very strange that Russia also neglected these kind of sociological changes, political changes that have happened in Ukraine since 2014. And if you think about this war actually started in 2014 already. So it's been ongoing for 8 years. And this is how many Ukrainians see the situation and feel that this is the case. And it's also important to note that this kind of Ukrainian will to defend, it's not a new phenomenon. We saw it in 2014 already. If you remember, the Crimean scenario was pretty easy for Russia. They came in, surprised Ukrainians. The Ukrainian security forces on Crimea were politically divided. Many of them actually joined Russia after this, took the badge away and bought the Russian badge back. But already weeks later in Donbass, you had quite a few people who from all over Ukraine traveled there to fight the Russian-supported separatists. We could perhaps call this spirit of 2014, the spirit of August 1914, of course, we all know about in the First World War. But this kind of volunteer spirit that happened in 2014, we have witnessed it already during the first days of war on a national scale. So we can perhaps talk about the spirit of 2022 now. And this is something that the Russians seem to have been very unprepared for. And of course, this is something that will change the course of war and has already changed the course of war, because it was this kind of a resistance that led to the failure of the original Russian strategy, which was probably just to sweep in, change the government, and then withdraw. And this, of course, hasn't happened. And now it sounds like they're already backing down from those claims. They are negotiating with Zelensky, and apparently they are not trying to change the government anymore. Of course, if they don't have the chance and, for instance, capture Kiev. The Ukrainian resistance, it has been much broader than Russia expected, and also the Ukrainian military capability has been much better than even many Ukrainians expected. So I know quite a few people in Ukraine who fought in 2014, 2015, and most of them then didn't fight during the intervening years. They are back fighting today. All of them are saying that they've been very surprised by the Ukrainian military capability. The Ukrainian military reforms have been much more successful than they expected. Caveat here, of course, is that these are people who are very critical of the Ukrainian military. And of course, they are now in the thick of things, so they might be a bit biased for understandable reasons. As far as we know, the Ukrainian forces have been able to inflict quite a few casualties on Russians so far. This was something many of us did not expect. So basically, Ukrainians have also been able to stop Russians from advancing in many places. And one surprising thing is that even the Ukrainian Air Force is still flying. Again, something we did not expect. One part of this resistance is tens of thousands of civilians who have been armed now. So Ukrainian had relatively liberal weapon laws before. Many people had arms home, but also the government started to give guns to tens of thousands of people. So in addition to this, perhaps 200,000 people in the Ukrainian army, we now have an estimated 200,000 more people. And again, remember, many of these people are actually combat veterans. Many of these people have been conscripts. And then we have just ordinary people without any military experience, also in guns, also in arms. The Ukrainian defense works, as far as I understand, so that these kind of less experienced forces take more rear guard duties, take care of logistics, take care of block posts and so on. And this way they free up forces for frontline duties. And the people I've been in contact with in the territorial defense, basically they work in relatively small units. I've seen videos and photos where people basically pimp up civilian vehicles, put machine guns behind, do these kinds of Mad Max kinds of things, create technicals basically. So apparently these units, they have pretty much freedom of maneuver to do things on the local areas. They have also used anti-tank weapons to take out Russian vehicles. They have escorted civilians who are fleeing Russian forces. And of course, then they do all other kinds of things. Continuously, these forces are also trained, not least in the use of anti-tank weapons that Ukraine is now receiving from the West. One other aspect of resistance is, of course, these captured areas, and especially captured cities that Russia has taken. We have seen non-violent protests in these cities. How is Russia going to deal with these things? It is one thing to occupy a place, but how do you control it after? How do you establish political control in cities where people actively resist in non-violent means? And this is something Russia struggles, and they have not been able to solve. And there's a number of things that you can do, starting from shooting demonstrators, but all of these things will have political costs, might have military costs as well. This is something to look out for. The Ukrainian morale overall, from my discussions with Ukrainians, seems extremely high. Overall, the narrative is that this is our home, we have nowhere to run to. Also, something to note is that we have apparently tens of thousands of Ukrainians who are coming back to Ukraine to fight. So we've had now, is it 3 million people who have fled Ukraine? This is mostly women and children. Half of these people are children. You have Ukrainian men coming back, especially, also Ukrainian women coming back to fight. Gender-wise, very interesting to look at this later. One thing, of course, that in the future, how this high morale and this high cost of war that Ukraine is paying, this extremely high cost of war, what we also should observe is that how is this going to affect the peace negotiations in the future? Ukrainians might not be very willing to make concessions to Russia. And today we have heard about this from Financial Times, about this new peace plan, which we can maybe talk about later. It might be that Zelensky's room of maneuver is a bit limited. And this is something we saw in 2014 with volunteer battalions, who were people who were armed. Difference is, of course, volunteer battalions were pretty small. Now we have mobilization on much broader scale. Two caveats, of course. One thing is that everything we know about the Ukrainian defense tends to come from Ukrainian sources. Much of this is, of course, propaganda, especially in the videos, pictures we see, in the memes we see. We see part of the war, and of course, this is part of propaganda action from Ukrainian side. The second thing, of course, is that Russian military is much bigger than the Ukrainian military. So Russia probably has much more room to make mistakes here. And here perhaps having been born in Finland, it's good to come back to the Winter War analogy here. The sociological things with Winter War that seem to work here as well. Also the smaller country being attacked unprovoked by a bigger one. But in Winter War, again, there were grave early mistakes from the Soviet forces. But after a while, the political negative leadership of the army was sort of released, and then the officers could lead or fight the war the way they wanted to fight the war. And hence Finland lost the war. So this is a very negative analogy in that way. Finally, I think it's good to remind everybody that Ukraine has the will to fight, but they really need the means to do it. And this is where each of us comes to play here. So that perhaps our will to resist Russian aggression is also very important here. And of course, our support can come in, and it comes in many forms, from economic sanctions against Russia to economic support to Ukraine, to cultural boycotts and whatnot, to military assistance, of course, which is very important part of this whole Ukrainian capability to fight against Russia. And of course, this kind of support from our side, it will hurt us as well in different ways. There are political costs, yes, economic costs, and so on. And this is something I think should be acknowledged and discussed a bit more. But at the same time, if you think about our costs, it's not the same cost that Ukraine is paying as we speak. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ilmari. I think that's a good segue straight over to Anna. Yeah, for yours.
Thank you, Oscar. So I wrote an essay, but I will try to keep it short. You have to tell me if I extend my time. I will try to mention a few things that I, think has not been really in the debate so far about urban wars in particular, as a kind of broader, more general thing. But first of all, it's kind of ironic, if I can put it like that, that given what we see in Ukraine, have seen like since the day one of the Russian invasion, Western armed forces have long considered urban war and urban warfare to be like a future thing, a future challenge, right? So, I mean, I looked up a few examples, like even after the, battles of Fallujah, General Mark A. Milley, he said that in the future, I can say with very high degree of confidence that the American army is probably going to be fighting in urban areas. And that's a different construct, he also added, and that's an important thing. But I mean, it's kind of, that has been the talk for such a long time. And given what we now see in Kiev and, Mariupol and all the other places, I think it's fair to say that the future is here now, and we need to really, really recognize that. Not least as a defense university, I think that's important. But so in what ways is the urban operational environment something different, a different construct, so to say? There are obviously many different answers to this. But I would like to say, first of all, it's not a matter of only looking at tactics or technologies, but we need to understand the urban space as such in order to understand how the operation unfolds, right, or the war unfolds. And I would also say it's necessary to have a broader kind of social scientific view of the war as it unfolds in urban areas, given that, we need a sense of geography, we need a sense of, how the materiality of the urban fabric kind of interacts with the war and the forces as such. And that means also, I think, tagging along what Johan said before, that we need to be a little bit humble when we talk about urban warfare in particular, and when we can, try to make our knowledge claims about it, because this is a very complex matter. But just to mention a few points, I mean, first of all, there's likely to be a huge presence of civilians. We've seen this already. Many have succeeded to leave, but many are also still there, like in Kiev or Mariupol, not least. And that means, as Martin covered and Maya Sefus and others have argued, that when that's the case, civilian casualties and victims are almost always exceed what can be called like collateral damage or any type of military necessity. And I will return to the civilian aspect of urban war in a bit, but it's also a very particular space given its three-dimensionality. So it kind of extends the battlefield in all directions, going up, going down, going all sideways, and like all the time, so to say. That also means that it's not, you know, there's a debate about urban war, whether it's like a neutral environment or whether it's kind of leaning towards in favor of the defendant. And I would say many would argue that it's the latter. So it's, you know, in the defendant's advantage to have the fight in an urban area. There are many places to hide, many places to take cover, many places to, you know, position oneself against the enemy, so to say. And also, of course, often the defending forces know the city better than the attacking forces. I mean, also what Ilmari talked about, I mean, the very question of civilians in the operational environment means also that it's not neutral, right? Because you have people that actively begin to take part in the fighting. And I think, you know, we shouldn't romanticize this, but we should actually take it for what it is. Like civilian people with often no military training who are suddenly part of the fighting, even though they might be, you know, not at the front, but still, they become targets in this. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. And also, I mean, there's often an assumption that in urban wars, civilian populations can be easily evacuated. I've seen that in the, you know, looking at MSB and the debate about urban warfare here in Sweden. And we can, you know, see now also one of the lessons from Ukraine that that's not necessarily as easily done as can be assumed. So that is also something to keep in mind when we, you know, discuss this further. And finally, I would say that urban war is a very different construct, so to say, because it relates to a much broader urban phenomenon called urbicide, meaning the killing of the city or the killing of the urban. And that is something different than, you know, other types of phenomena that we often talk about when we talk about war, such as genocide or culturecide / memoricide. In those cases, I mean, it's either directly, you know, concerning the people, genocide, or it's concerning a particular culture, a particular heritage, and so forth. But in this case, and I mean, we can see this already happening in Ukraine as we speak. It's not only, you know, culturally or historically significant buildings or museums or mosques or churches that are targeted, but like the everyday urban life is targeted. So you have like residential complexes, apartment houses, cafes, bars, squares, restaurants, streets, you know, killing the whole idea of an urban life. And that has implications far beyond the ending of the war, whenever that comes in this case, because it kind of has to do with the urban identities and the way that people used to live in these places, and now they have to rebuild it somehow. So I will stop there, and I think I kept my time.
Very good. No, and I think thank you very much for the panel. And I think when I give 5 to 7 minutes, 5 to 7 academic minutes, so we're exactly on time as always. And I think I will ask a couple of follow-up questions because you all touched upon it. And I think what everyone is thinking about now is really how bad is the Russian military? How did this really happen? And what will happen next? And I will pose those in order. I think I'll first start with Johan. Pushing you a little bit further, because I think, you know, the first days of the wars, we saw some kind of thunder raids with the hope of you know, Ukraine just collapsing. Whereas my sense is at least that they're starting to act a lot more coherently and doing it more slower, more methodically, and start working with things such as air defense cover, etc. So really, how bad is it, and how much innovation and change have we seen so far?
How many hours do we have? No, I think it's obviously much worse than we expected.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, I mean, as you pointed out, I overestimated it. But that was what the sort of available evidence that we had at the time could lead us to. And yes, we wrote in our delimitations, of course, we are guessing and speculating and so on, and try to be very clear with that. But that doesn't help because people read the conclusions anyway and take them as sort of very firm. So that's a methodological problem to deal with. My hunch is that A, planning was poor or very politicized. As the Brits say, proper prior planning prevents poor performance, 6 Ps. And something went wrong here, obviously. And I also think that they might have switched operational plan after a week or so when the first one didn't work out. And that is always extremely complex thing to do. New orders, etc., rearranging your forces. And also the big difference is that compared to exercises that I have studied, in war, people shoot back. People deliberately try to disrupt whatever you try to do, and you don't have that in exercises. And you cannot simulate that fully in peacetime. So exercises is the best we have. When you in peacetime try to look at military capabilities in war. But it's not good enough, obviously. A brief answer.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think it's important to emphasize the point which you know, colleagues are doing as well. I think there's a reason why analysts such as you and myself, there's actually a lot of military capability out there, even though the application we've seen also lacks from information selection bias, as Ilmari said. Well, you know, we see everything that Ukraine is doing right, and we see everything Russia's doing wrong, but we don't see everything Ukraine is doing wrong, and we don't see everything Russia's doing right. So I think that should also give a cause for modesty. Ilmari, regarding the point how this happened and bad assumptions, I want to ask if isn't this the assumptions pre-2014 that was still there? Because what happened then was actually Donetsk and Luhansk fell through, you know, some creation of insurgencies, almost, and you know, Crimea as well. Wasn't those assumptions quite fair if it would have been before the last invasion of Ukraine in 2014?
Yeah, if it had been the Ukrainian society in 2014, perhaps, maybe. But now Putin started war in 2014 and somehow missed the implications, the consequences for Ukrainian society, Ukrainian politics during those 8 years, and also the Ukrainian military reforms at the time. So it has been said that Putin has united the Ukrainian nation, and I think it's fair to say that there's much to it. Of course, we need to be careful about talking about a nation in any context. But obviously, some people during the 8 years have realized that there's a war going against Russia, and that war might escalate. That said, it's also fair to say that Ukrainian preparedness wasn't as good as it perhaps should have been. They didn't mobilize before the war. Also, it's only now we start to see use of mines, which perhaps one could have expected that they would have had in other places than in the than against the separatist regions as well. So that even on that side, one did make mistakes early on. But still, in 2014, Crimea operation, that worked because of surprise and because of the favorable political situation on the peninsula. But even then, the same plan didn't really, or similar kind of plan didn't work in the Donbas region. And there, actually, Russian regular forces had to come and save the separatists from being annihilated by the Ukrainian volunteers and the Ukrainian army. So that you look one side of the thing and not the other, that happens just weeks weeks later. That appears very strange.
And I'll ask one question for Anna as well. And I think so far it seems that the Russian forces are intentionally avoiding cities, as you're saying, because of the difficulty there. And my reading of the bombings is really terror bombing to force, you know, destroy the city for submission. Do you have any take on, you know, is that an effective strategy? Will it work? Will it? I know it's speculation, but if you have any take on, I mean, the second best thing when they can't take it military, they'll just throw bombs and hope to give up. Or has that worked? Can it work? Or I know it's, you know, you have to make what it do with it.
I mean, we'll have to see, right? But judging from history, I would say that's a pretty problematic strategy, of course. But I mean, one thing that has surprised me a little bit, although I'm by no means an expert on Russian warfare, is the little use of precision weapons. Even though, I mean, many scholars of urban warfare would also say that it doesn't really matter, because in an urban setting, you know, the kind of margin of error is, even if it's still a few meters, it becomes pretty huge in an urban setting. So maybe, I mean, there's a difference of degree rather than of a kind, perhaps. But I mean, yeah, I don't know, but I'm worried about what we can see, if I put it that way, because I think it's, you know, an herbicide in the making. Yeah,
no,
at the moment. So,
quick comment from you, Juan, and then we'll open up the floor, and Camilla might also have the virtual floor.
Just to follow on to that observation, if war is a violent handling of a disagreement and sort of difference of wills, political will is in the people. People live in cities in Ukraine. 70% pre-war used to live in cities. So if you want to get sort of break Ukraine's political will through the people, you have to go through the cities. So this could be one way. What they do now is basically to empty the cities by shelling them, also creating refugee problems in the West.
A small one,
but also it's a risky strategy, because how long can we just look at Russians bombing Ukrainian citizens? So that Russia might also have a bit of a problem here. How far can they go?
Yep, absolutely. Okay, who wants to, Arvid, and please introduce yourself.
Sorry about that. My name is Arvid Åhlund. I'm an editorial writer at Danielsson. I just want to follow up on what you just said. Because basically you're saying there are costs for Russia doing this. What are those costs? The West reacting? And in what way? Because, I mean, for us watching TV, basically we hear Joe Biden saying that would be World War III. So we're not really seeing that. So can you just elaborate on that bit? And also, I just like, basically, what I want to know is, how long can Russia keep this going? Morally, materially? Because it seems like they're basically bombing them into submission and it's bombing them back to the Stone Age. So can we just sit here and wait until that's done? And what are the sort of implications of
that? I'll give it to you, Ilmari, but also Anna, Johan, if you want to join in, you're welcome to.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yes, for the online audience. The question was responses from the West. What will we do? How long will we watch it? Will it be World War III? And how long can Russia really do this? So some small defined question. We'll put it into the panel.
It's very difficult to answer this question, of course. It depends on us, of course, partly, that how long are we going to watch this, and because we, of course, in democracies do affect our political leaders. It's difficult to say, but also I think the moral cost is very important that you mentioned. If these kinds of views of war, ideas of war, Russians, as far as I understand, many of them actually believe that they are not bombing in Ukraine at all. If these kinds of ideas, news comes to Russia, do they start to reflect about these things as well? Also, I think it might be morally a bit difficult for Russian soldiers to do these kinds of things, shooting at civilians, because they are people too. But I think it is at this stage, it is what they are trying to do, to terrorize, to raise costs for Ukraine. But there might be a real ceiling for how far they can go with, and because how far can we watch at this? It is horrible now, but if it just keeps going and going and going, perhaps at some point we actually do feel that we need to stop it somehow.
Yeah, that's somehow is what I'm interested in.
Yes, and that's.
We'll see if the rest of the panel has. Anna?
I mean, I think the internal pressure in Russia is going to be key. as many commentators also have mentioned. But at the same time, we have examples, you know, Syria. It can go pretty far, and it can be pretty bad before, you know. So, but I would, you know, focus on the internal dynamics in Russia for that answer, I think.
Well, there are many things you can say, but I think it's very important what we do, the outside world in the West. We talk a lot about Russia this, Russia that, and so on. What we do matters as well. Sanctions, great, but that will not stop this war in the short term anyway. It will stop Russia's next war, or reduce the chances for next war. To give a very short answer, what we can do now is to arm Ukraine. Give them the means, as somebody said here, not just the will. If you want to affect the military balance, because I don't think that right now, as I see it, given the reservations of sources and all that, neither side can make it decisive to break the back of the other militarily with conventional forces. Ukraine has very little to escalate with in terms of manpower and so on. They have what they have. Russia may have some more, and that's a big question out there. How much more do they have? We actually don't know exactly. At least I don't know exactly from open sources, and I'm not sure anyone knows it either. Russia can escalate in other ways as well. But for the moment, that is where we can affect the equation in this war. It's actually supply arms to Ukraine. But that also says very much about our willingness to take risks. Some people would argue, why didn't we have much harder sanctions in 2014? Then we wouldn't have had this. Perhaps this is a war that is coming to us eventually anyway. We don't know, but that is what we think about it, and that will matter. We can never get a precise answer from the future like that.
I'll abuse the chairman's position and just add one thing, and I think that how far is the West willing to go is completely unknowable, because 3 weeks ago, before the war started, and you talked to Western policymakers, and they said, this is how far we will go. You know, we've blown way past that point, and every day there's Ukrainians dying on TV. The pressure would just increase, and that will bring us to things, which is, I mean, no-fly zone is being discussed. That means shooting Russian planes. That would potentially be a World War III event, or it would not. That we don't know, but that's it. And then I'll also do shameless plug. It's an article published an hour ago that I wrote for Express, and this is the 4 ways in which the war will end. So go read it, and there you have all the other answers left unanswered. More questions from the floor. We have one from Michael, and then from there.
Hey, Mike Poznansky from the Naval War College in the US. Fabulous panel. My question builds just on this discussion that was happening about escalation, which I think is the million-dollar question. A no-fly zone, a limited no-fly zone, what types of military support we're providing, what if Vladimir Putin uses chemical weapons? Can you just talk about, it's an unknowable question, what's the threshold for escalation and bringing other states in or expanding the war regionally? But can you just reflect a little bit on what you see as where those thresholds are, how we might know them in advance, and kind of where we might be headed?
I'll take one other question straight away as well.
Thank you. As the graph in the beginning showed, the Russian armed forces is a gigantic organization. Despite this, there have been reports of Belarusian troops, Syrian troops, and that Russia has asked China for material support. I can't speak for the accuracy of these reports, but that's what's being reported. So my question is, what do these collaborations mean? Have the Russian warfighter resources already been depleted, or do these collaborations have a different political purpose?
Thank you very much. And I'll repeat the questions for our virtual audience. First of all, what are the thresholds for escalations, and what are the red lines? And then the question is, are Russia running out of resources as they're asking for Belarusian troops, Syrian troops, and Chinese aid? And what does that mean? I think I'll start with you, Johan.
Okay, I'll do the allies and resources bit. Yes, I've seen these reports. These are all except for the Chinese, I don't know sort of the scale and scope of that, but all the other ones are pretty marginal. I don't think they're not going to make a big difference. And I also think, I mean, I'm a military interpreter myself originally. How are 6,000 Syrians or 16,000 going to work in a Russian operation? What language will they speak? Very basic stuff. Perhaps they have some arrangement that works in Syria, but will it work in Ukraine? Not sure. And apart from that, Russia has really few allies. Oh, Russia has 2 allies. It's army and it's fleet. Armia I fought, Vasa Yuznik. Yeah, you know the one. So that's what they really rely on. So I'm not, and I'm not sure the resources are depleted. This is also a political thing. We are not alone, because what Russia is facing now is something they really hate, being isolated from the world. Most of the world is basically saying no, or just sitting on the sidelines, not saying anything. And very, very few come out in real open support. This is especially important in the West, and also to tie into the question about escalation. If we can keep united in the West, that will make a world of a difference when it comes to this. If we're all behind the escalatory steps we take, so far so good, that will be key.
Can I push you to say something about nuclear weapons as well?
You can try. To say something, will Russia use nuclear weapons? You have to be inside the head of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, and that's Vladimir Putin himself. He will be involved in the decision. As military analysts, I can say they're there. They're available to train with them, and they have them for a reason. And we would be fools to sort of disregard and say, you know, they would never do that. Really? They wouldn't attack Ukraine either a month ago. So I cannot exclude anything, really.
Ilmari?
I mean, I can just jump onto that. I mean, I think the symbolic political value in, you know, getting help from one's allies is perhaps the greatest value in that. I'm not no expert on that, but it's, you know, clearly a symbolic gain for Russia at this moment. I think this whole discussion about nuclear weapons is really interesting also in another sense. I mean, yes, we need to take it seriously. Yes, it's terrible and all that, but it also kind of plays into the hands of Putin, doesn't it? I mean, that, you know, it becomes this great power struggle rather than I mean, it kind of puts Ukraine a little bit at the marginal, and we need to keep in mind that this is actually, you know, an invaded country, even though, you know, they might be victims of that. I mean, hopefully not, but it's a country with its own agency, and we need to keep the focus on what is actually happening here.
Allies. So of course it's easier if Syrians die and not Russians die in Ukraine. So that's politically easier for Russia. When it comes to the thresholds and red lines, some of them have been discussed earlier on. Biden has put some cards on the table already early on and said that no ground troops will be there. Then I think some other things can be more negotiated. For instance, the discussion about the mix that could have been given to Ukrainians to pilot. Perhaps not such a great strategic move to play with open cards here, but one could have perhaps had a bit of strategic ambiguity here and said that we are considering these kinds of things. I think there's a number of things we can do, from smuggling things to Ukraine, for instance, and not telling anyone and then claiming that Russian news are fake news or whatever. Which Russia, of course, has done before in Donbass, for instance. So I think there's quite a bit we can do. Unfortunately, Russia can also do quite a bit.
Johan, quick comment? No? Okay, good. Then we'll take one question online. Do you have a favorite one, Camilla?
Can you comment on China's role for the outcome of the war?
Mm-hmm.
Can I also pitch in another one?
Yeah.
We've not seen the Navy involved so much so far. I've heard the Navy's gathering. Is that confirmed? And can it be of any significance since Turkey is not represented? So two different questions.
Mm-hmm. So one question about China's role and one question about the Navy. Who feel obliged?
China's role. China doesn't have to do very much to win here. Having the Russia and the West at loggerheads like this, grinding each other down, and China just waits. I think that China might perhaps have some influence on Russia, but cannot be seen to have too much influence on Russia. And I'm not sure how far they will go. This is turning into an existential issue for Russia. I'm not sure that the Chinese wanted to turn into an existential one for China. Will China pick a war with the West for Ukraine? Doubt it. What was the question about naval forces?
Yeah, the role of the Navy and what's the significance, and can they operate as Turkey is close to straits?
I mean, well, that's a big one. But talking about the Black Sea, Navy has been pretty passive at the moment. For the moment, whether that depends on Ukrainian countermeasures, I don't know. But this is also essentially a ground operation. Russian armed forces are sort of the ground forces of a continental power. That is what counts. Navy and Air Force are always sort of in a supporting role somehow, trying to keep other problems away. So now, for example, Black Sea Fleet, keep the NATO fleets at bay, keep them away from this operation, for example. But they cannot make a decisive move, I think, unless they manage to do this landing operation somewhere. But I haven't seen that carried out to its full yet.
Yeah. Yeah. If you don't disagree, I'll collect some more questions then from the room. We have one there.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Tim. I'm a student at the Bachelor Program in Social Science. My question is, how independent is Russia? We've seen sanctions now, but they seem to be able to continue the war effort. What more can we do, and how well do they make?
That's a very good question, because we in the West say sanctions are great. This is what we can do.
Wait. Just repeat the question. How independent is Russia, and what can they? How long can they do it?
Yeah. Okay. The sanctions affects Russia's future. What Russia fights with today is what they have invested in the past. So you always come to war with what you have today, and sanctions will start hurting now and from into the future. That's the simple question. So sanctions will not harm Russia's operation in the short term. Perhaps later, but I can't. That must be months at least, and we can say that perhaps the next few weeks are decisive, but we don't know. And also, just to remind you, the Bosnia, the wars in Yugoslavia, early 90s, mid 90s, they carried on for a few years, and then suddenly other countries got sucked in. Eventually, the Americans as well, when something happened. So it's only 3 weeks after this war, and it's definitely not over yet. So we can't tell. And it has happened before that war attracts other countries, whether they want to or not.
So sanctions, they also raise the political costs for Russian decision makers by making their life miserable for ordinary Russians. And already we have seen, I've seen reports of 200,000 Russians leaving the country, and that's also going to affect them quite a lot, or might affect them.
I meant to add on that, we are thinking like perfectly rational Westerners. I have learned the hard way working with Russia that thinking as a Swede is not good enough. And I am a Swede. So I quite often get it wrong, and I have to be very humble about that. Why did Russia do this? Why did Putin do this? He wants to and he can. I would never do it because I found all these rational reasons not to. But my rationality is not the same. It's probably not the right one either. So before we project our own rationality onto Russia, we have to think twice, because we might get it wrong. I'm not sure that the current political elite in Russia bothers that very much about people.
They might not, but it does raise political costs.
It does, but whether it is decisive in any sense, could be in the long run, not now.
I agree with this. Yeah.
We'll collect two last questions. We had one here.
My name is Magdalena Baranowska. I'm a graduate student from Johns Hopkins. There was some mention of military adaptation on the field by Russian forces when we were discussing Russian military effectiveness. I was wondering if you could sort of elucidate, sort of expand upon instances of that adaptation, if any.
Yeah, and then one more question. I think we have Justin.
Yeah, so it's probably a natural question for Johan.
And an introduction.
Oh, sorry, I'm Justin Cantle. I'm a postdoc at the Harvard Belfer Center in the United States. So yeah, I was kind of curious about the 2019 capabilities assessment and how we got it so wrong, and I want to push on that a little bit. So since all of you touched on it, maybe all of you could talk about this, but I think naturally I'm going to direct this toward Johan. So how sure can we be about our conclusions about what was off and what was not off, given that Russia had made a decision to hold back significant forces? You know, the Air Force basically is not in play here. A lot of PGMs are not in play here. Also, you know, I didn't see up there anything about logistics. Terrain is obviously related to that, but there's a ton of logistical problems that Russia has faced that we wouldn't have maybe anticipated, like the soldiers are starving and they can't get fuel to them. So how do these things factor in? And you know, maybe one third thing too is that in order to judge the effectiveness of the Russian campaign, we need to know what the political aims actually are. But we're sort of presuming that it's conquest, but maybe it's not. Maybe it didn't start out that way. Maybe it's no longer conquest. So how do all these things factor into the assessment? And maybe did you do better than you think you give yourself credit for?
Way too long. So we have two questions. One on military adaptation and how instances we've seen of it, and the short about is really an epistemological question of how can we know what we know, especially where we haven't seen a lot of the things that we have seen, and also as we're not sure about the political goal to evaluate it. But we'll start with you, Johan, and then
on the question about adaptation and effectiveness. Actually, I haven't studied that phenomenon as such, but combat breeds adaptation or you die. It's very simple in that sense. You bring women. What strikes me though is that Russia use old kit, old tanks, old howitzers, because that's what they have. We tend to look at all the fancy new stuff that they have and they build and Wunderwaffen that Putin showed on his screen and so on. But that's not what the Russian armed forces look like. They are an improved version of the Soviet army. Same type of fighting, artillery, and then infantry, not sort of, and it's more emphasis on indirect fires, for example. But so they adapt as well as they can, I think. Effectiveness, reaching their goals, I think the goal is not conquest because Ukraine's too big, but it's control, the exercise of power. And that's much more elusive. When are they happy? When do they feel they have it? If there's a peace deal or sort of some kind of agreement in the making, perhaps that gives them at least the appearance of having that control against something. I don't know, I haven't seen the contents of that plan. And as about what we know and what we don't know, to be frank, when you look at the open source ability, when I sit at the desk in my office in Stockholm trying to assess an organization of 1 million men, hundreds of thousands of pieces of equipment spread across 11 time zones, and what they could do in something that hadn't happened yet. No, I don't know very much, to be very frank, but I have to do the best I can with what I have. Take up the data points you can, try to not be in a Westerner. You look at what do the Russians think about war? What do they call an operation? And what do the exercises actually look like, etc., from what they say. And that's what we try to do, using Russian sources to describe that. And some things we got right, actually. It wasn't all that bad, but I can't say that we got it all right. And some things we have to rethink. But that's pretty normal scientific work, I would say, isn't it?
And military power always needs a context as well to express itself, whereas the assessment is always done in a vacuum. And that's another part of the tricky part.
And an enemy gets to say as well.
Say again?
The enemy gets also say to the matter.
Of course, yes. Yeah. I usually show a picture of a chessboard that we can describe the chess pieces, and the game is chess, and there's an adversary on the side, but we cannot describe each individual game. That's how far we can go.
Well, I think we will leave it at that. I don't know about the audience, but I enjoyed it a lot, and that's at least something. We will thank all the listeners online, and I will invite especially our guests from the conference to join us in the military mess, but also, of course, students. It's your mess. And if you like the speakers, give them a beer or a non-alcoholic beverage. So let's thank everyone with a warm round of applause, and thank you all for joining.